From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. A federal judge freezes the Trump administration's freeze on billions of dollars in federal grants, loans, and financial aid. But many questions remain after the first White House briefing of the new term, including tariffs. We'll discuss the fallout with Mary Lovely at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. The top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee has questions for the Trump White House. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois joins us on the dismissals of inspectors general, the firings of lawyers on Jack Smith's old team, and mass deportations now hitting cities like Chicago. And House Republicans huddling over a tax and spending plan a day after the president addressed the group in Miami. We'll have more ahead with our political panel. Thanks for being with us here on the late edition of Balance of Power. The Tuesday edition, another first for the Trump White House today as we learn live together on Bloomberg TV and radio. The first press briefing since Donald Trump was sworn in as president. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, the youngest person to ever hold the job, fielded questions from a very crowded room of reporters on everything from the pause in federal aid to mass deportation to tariffs and the president's deadline for tariffs on Saturday.
The president has made it very clear, again, that he expects every nation around this world to cooperate with the repatriation of their citizens. And the president has also put out specific statements in terms of Canada and Mexico when it comes to what he expects in terms of border security. We have seen a historic level of cooperation from Mexico. But again, as far as I'm still tracking, and that was last night talking to the president directly, February 1st is still on the books.
Joining us now for more, Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsin and Mario Parker, both reporting on politics here in Washington, and it's great to have both of you with us. Mario, I'm going to start with you. You spent a lot of time sitting in that briefing room over the course of your career. Here we go again with a new crop of reporters in some cases, and certainly a new and very young press secretary. I want to start you with some of the breaking news. You had a hard time answering some of the questions on this federal aid freeze. She kept referring to a memo that did not include many details, and now we have the freeze temporarily halted by a judge. What does it mean about where we are now in this administration's early days?
Well, a couple of things. It means that the social groups, the Democratic-leaning groups, were ready for this. I was surprised at how quickly they got out of the gate this morning with a lawsuit, and at least for right now, it looks like that lawsuit holds. Now, dialing it back to Caroline Leavitt's first press briefing as press secretary, one of the things you'll note, she did field a wide range of questions, but one of the things that the pivot that the White House made immediately after that was to release a memo that had the Q&As to try to tamp down some of the temperature and the angst around Medicaid, Medicare, Meals on Wheels, all of those different programs, trying to give a little bit more clarity after they, in response to bipartisan alarm. Yeah.
Clearly a well-rehearsed press secretary, was ready for this room full and had a slightly different approach, too, when it came to so-called new media, making the three-letter networks in the front row wait a little bit while she went to the back and sides of the room to talk to the likes of Breitbart or other new media companies. What's this relationship with the Trump White House and the press going to be like?
I mean, it's a good sign that she did come to the briefing room immediately, that we do have a press secretary who wants to engage with the press, because we used to go for months on end with no briefing, regular briefings in the first term. At the end, she was asked how often we should expect to see her engaging with the media. You know, should we expect it to be regular every single day as it is traditionally? And she had an answer that we've already seen playing out, that Donald Trump is his own best spokesperson, and he likes to be available, and he'll do 60-minute impromptu press conferences, basically, or just Q&As, gaggles with reporters. And she said, you know, we should expect to see quite a bit of that.
Well, that's right. I don't know if it's going to be a daily briefing. To their point, Donald Trump's talking to reporters every day, Mario. Is that what we should get used to?
I think we should. If past his prologue and the early 7 days of this administration are any type of evidence, well, I mean, we've had two gaggles on Air Force One in the past week. We've had Chopper Talk, which is where he speaks with the reporters out back of the White House when he's leaving. We have the Oval Office interview where our colleague Josh Wingrove kind of had a master class in questioning the president as well. So we've seen, I mean, to Caroline Leavitt's credit, we have seen a lot of access to the press with the president.
Josh Wingrove had a lot of questions about tariffs today in that briefing as well. President Trump last night talked about his plans to tariff foreign semiconductor chips, among other things. Listen.
In the very near future, we're going to be placing tariffs on foreign production of computer chips, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals to return production of these essential goods to the United States of America. They left us and they went to Taiwan, which is about 98% of the chip business, by the way, and we want them to come back.
Donald Trump has said a lot of things about tariffs. There were expectations we might see across-the-board tariffs implemented on day one when he was signing the flurry of executive actions. He's still kind of dancing around the way this is going to work. Do we have across-the-board 2.5%? He said he wants bigger than that. Could we have directed tariffs with that deadline this weekend for Canada, Mexico, and others? Do we have tariffs against specific products like he was mentioning, or do we get all of them?
Here's the thing, Joe. Where did the expectations for day one tariffs come from? We were just talking about this today in the newsroom. Yeah. He never said on day one, I will have tariffs.
So did we start that?
I don't know where it came from, but the expectation was there, and maybe he's enjoying that, right? Because look what happened over the weekend. He announces tariffs on Colombia, and immediately he has a deal. We saw this before he took office in November, before Thanksgiving. He announces possible tariffs on Canada. Trudeau was on the next flight to Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah. So never implement the tariffs so they can always be a threat?
Well, one thing I think we're seeing Donald Trump doing is he's walking around the room, that being a globe, and he's wielding this cudgel around. Nobody knows what's going to happen with this cudgel, but everybody thinks that he'll wield it at some point. He's saying he's going to wield it at some point, and everybody, right now he's able to assess who's going to kowtow, who's going to acquiesce to some of his demands.
Well, it's, I guess, to Saleha's point, working. If you look at the example of Colombia, how many times can he use that playbook now that we've all read it?
I think when you're overseeing the most powerful economy in the world, you have a lot of latitude to do that, right? Before people's wherewithal begins to kind of diminish and they think that it's just bluster and bluff.
Well, we're having this conversation in Washington. The Republican conference is in the House, is in Miami. They're at Trump's Doral Resort. He left them there, gave them a big pep talk last night, and they're supposed to come home with a plan, a congressional agenda and approach to taxes and spending. This is happening just as Scott Bessent starts his new job as the Treasury Secretary. Will this help to train our focus on tariffs and maybe get some details in the coming days?
It's possible. There's not a lot of unity right now around one or two reconciliation bill between the White House and Congress, and that leaves tax policy a little bit out in the lurch until we know when that could come together. And tariffs might be a negotiating tool right there, just domestically, that we don't want. Maybe they don't want House lawmakers to have to see tariffs implemented and cause inflation in their districts. Maybe they would use that as a little bit of a roadblock to tax policy moving forward. So, yeah, I think taxes and tariffs both need to be discussed there to figure out where can Congress step in and how quickly can they get one bill versus two bills.
It's hard to decide one without the other. If you listen to what Scott Bessent has said before he became Treasury Secretary, how do you set the tariff levels when it comes to revenue, if that's going to be raising revenue to offset the tax cuts without knowing where those levels are?
And to Saleha's point, who's done great reporting on this throughout the election and the transition, I mean, what you saw last night, hidden in some of the details with Trump's response to 2.5%, was a message to Scott Bessent. So one thing we'll be on the lookout for is how quickly Scott Bessent comes out to publicly champion some of the things that Trump has said, because the thought has been that he's much more dovish than Trump is.
I haven't brought up the Fed, of course. We're out of time, but does Jay Powell get a shot across the bow tomorrow if there's no rate cut?
I don't know, but I also think he's going to get questions about tariffs and the impact on the economy and inflation tomorrow. So we will hear from him on Trump policies that will affect interest rates.
It's going to be an interesting conversation. Your eyes will be on Truth Social, I suspect, as always. Mario Parker, Saleha, Mohsin, great conversation. Thank you so much for getting us started tonight. Coming up, we'll look more closely at the Justice Department's dismissal of more than a dozen officials involved in Jack Smith's investigation of President Trump, as well as this breaking story, Donald Trump's freeze on grant funding temporarily halted by a judge. Illinois Senator Dick Durbin, the top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, will be with us next, live from Capitol Hill on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
The scales of justice will be rebalanced. the vicious, violent, and unfair weaponization of the Justice Department and our government will end.
That was President Trump on Inauguration Day. Can you believe that was just 8 days ago? Yesterday, the acting attorney general moved to fire more than a dozen Justice Department employees who worked on the Jack Smith investigations, the special counsel who was investigating then former President Trump. Joining us now to talk about this and a lot more today is Illinois Senator Dick Durbin, the ranking member on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to see you. We hear the line a lot. Elections have consequences. Was President Trump acting within his authority? Was he acting legally in firing these people?
Well, there's a question about that and about a lot of other things in 8 days. This notion, a gentleman named Mr. Vaith was the acting director of the Office of Management and Budgeting. He sends out this notice yesterday that basically shuts down the federal government in terms of the money that's flowing to local communities. And so with one dash of the pen, he ends up hurting the kids in Head Start, hurting the elderly people who are in food programs, and then cutting off medical research. It took a federal judge today to bring people back to their senses.
Well, that just developed, in fact. You're right. The president's freeze on grant funding and aid has been temporarily halted by a judge. And I'd love to get your take on a lot of the actions that we've seen in the last 8 days. With regard to the Department of Justice, though, is it the president's right to fire those people who in many cases serve beyond a single president's term?
Well, many of them are career employees, and certainly they have their legal rights under the law, and they're going to assert them in many instances. I think to have maximum effect and to have reaction from the public, you're seeing some of these extreme things happening in the Department of Justice and other departments. Ultimately, this will be sorted out in the courtroom.
Well, I guess it will be. You've also got inspectors general from any number of agencies, dozens in this case, that have been fired. The president, the White House, did not notify Congress, as would typically be the custom here. I believe it's 30 days notice. Was this move legal?
Of course not. He tick-tocked this issue just like he did the tick-tock issue. Ignore the law, ignore what the courts say, do what you care to do. And in this situation, is basically saying the inspector generals are gone. Who are these women and men? They are individuals who have no allegiance to the individual heads of the agency. Their allegiance is to the law and to the Constitution and to the budget. And they call them as they see them. They're the referees and the umpires. Well, he wanted to get them off of the scene as quickly as possible so that he could pursue this next measure of shutting down federal spending. It's not a pretty picture, and it indicates gathering of more and more power by Donald Trump at a time in history when we need to be careful to be respectful of this Constitution.
Well, that brings us to the actions of today. And as we just learned, once again, a judge has halted the president's freeze on grant funding. There were already some hiccups today. We tried to get answers at a White House press briefing, and there were some clarifying remarks from the press secretary's office. But we do know that the online portal for Head Start is warning of delays here. Before that judge's ruling, the online Medicaid portal was not accessible in some states, including Illinois. And so it becomes a question of what do you do about it now, Senator? If there's not a legal solution, will there be a legislative one?
Well, I don't know that a legislative one is worth anything at this point, because Donald Trump has basically announced with TikTok and the inspectors general he's going to ignore the law. He doesn't care what Congress says. And with the spending decision that was made yesterday that caused such chaos all across the country and hurt so many innocent people, is basically a decision on their part that they're going to go ahead and do it. The law be damned. So the American people have basically got to stand up and take notice here that there are some people who are part of the transition that are in a radical and extreme position.
Well, there are reports that some Senate Democrats, some of your colleagues, are calling for a delay to slow the confirmation process of Russell Vought to head up the Office of Management and Budget until this freeze is taken off the table or at least somehow clarified. Would you support that?
Yes. Mr. Vought's got his fingerprints all over this. This Project 2025, they're following this roadmap. They disavow it and say they really didn't know what was going on. President Trump said he'd never heard of the thing. And basically, when it boils down to, if you read it, they're following that roadmap just stop by stop. And unfortunately, it violates the law and Constitution.
Well, so you brought us there, and we can all check our mail after this conversation. When you start talking about Project 2025, the antennas go up across Washington. What are the breadcrumbs that Russ Vought left in that document that leads you to what he will do here, or informs your view on what he will do inside the White House?
I tell you, there's some radical ideas in there and extreme ideas. They won't make America great again. They'll hurt a lot of innocent people. And if we want to be #1 in the world, and I certainly hope we aspire to that, we've got to have the means of educating and providing for the basic citizenry of this country to excel. And Project 2025 has a negative attitude toward this government's role in helping people and businesses get off the ground and succeed.
So it's been 8 days, as we've established. Senator, you have a pretty important role on the Judiciary Committee as the confirmation process unfolds here. And you're going to have quite a conversation. I know you had the Pam Bondi hearings, but many folks are eagerly awaiting Kash Patel, who, of course, the president has chosen to run the FBI. You've gone out of your way to talk about this, and I know that you're not a fan of Kash Patel, as you've pointed out. He is the man who wants to run the FBI, but also claims the FBI is responsible for what took place on January 6th. He posted on social media, January 6th, never an insurrection, cowards in uniform exposed. Will you ask him to prove the FBI's involvement as some sort of inside job that day?
Absolutely, and there's no proof, no evidence of that whatsoever. The thing about this Kash Patel person is we have his playbook. He wrote a book and spelled out all of his weird conspiracy theories in detail. Now President Trump wants to give this man 38,000 FBI agents and professionals all over the world so he can pursue all his weird conspiracy theories. I mean, that's not fair to America. If we want to keep this country safe away from drugs and terrorism and assaults on our body politic, we need someone who has a responsibility and a record of proven performance. Mr. Patel ain't even close.
Wow. Well, we'll see this unfold. As I read from your statement, after meeting with Kash Patel, I have grave concerns about his fitness for the role of FBI director. He has neither the experience, the temperament, or the judgment to lead the FBI. Kristi Noem, however, Senator, got her job to run Homeland Security and gave her first remarks today. As we hear reports of mass deportations, she actually posted some videos of them happening in New York. Here's what she said about the agency's jurisdiction.
That we can to protect the American people. We have jurisdiction over people who live here, people who leave here, and people who come here. We have jurisdiction over products that come into this country and which ones leave. We have jurisdiction over our internet, what comes in, what goes out, what kind of business has. Virtually, I tell people we have jurisdiction over everything. And we will exercise all legal authorities that we have to protect this country because it is the only last light of freedom left.
So, Senator, what should employers and, in fact, workers in cities like Chicago be prepared for as we talk about mass deportation and workplace raids?
Let me tell you, it's going to have an impact not only in individual lives of people, many of whom are innocent and shouldn't be swept up in this mass deportation. It's going to have an impact on businesses. When business leaders come to my office, whether the hospitality industry, restaurant industry, you name it, they tell us that migrants and immigrants working on their workforce are critical to their success. 40% of the agricultural workers in Illinois are undocumented. If this administration is going to shut down their activities on the farm, I guarantee the produce section is going to look a lot worse in the stores across America, and we're going to see a lot of things increasing in price. That is not what the American people voted for in the last election.
Senator, we'll be watching for you Thursday morning in that hearing we discussed. Illinois Senator Dick Durbin, we thank you for your time, as always, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, we'll have a preview of tomorrow's Fed decision with Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
You said that you would demand that the interest rates come down.
Well, I would put in a strong statement.
Do you expect the Fed to listen to you?
Yeah.
Are you going to talk to Powell about this and bringing the rates down?
At the right time, I would.
President Trump last week in the Oval Office talking about Fed independence, or I guess lack thereof. Now with tomorrow's rate decision ahead, the first of the new Trump administration, we take a look at what we can expect with Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe, of course, watching the Fed and the economy for us here in Washington. Great to have you with us on the eve of this event. He thinks we're getting a rate cut tomorrow? The market doesn't.
The market doesn't, and this is actually one of the less drama-filled meetings that we've had in a couple of months. You know, people largely expect the Fed to be on hold tomorrow, and if that happens, then the big question becomes, how long are they going to be on hold? So I think a lot of the press conference tomorrow with Chair Powell is going to be looking at the months to come. How long does the Fed think it will be on hold? And how are they starting to think about some of these Trump policies that are starting to take shape?
Well, when you look at the composite of data we see recently, it's pretty hard to make the argument for a rate cut. Donald Trump is demanding one. What is this relationship going to be like?
Well, if it's anything like what it was like in his first term, we can expect a little bit of tension. And just in his first few days in office, we've already seen him say that he knows interest rates better than the Fed officials. Yeah, and we've already seen him say that if he disagrees with them on policy, he said, I'm going to make it known. So I think you're going to see Chair Powell get questions about what the relationship with Trump will be like and how they're thinking about some of these policies. But I think you're going to see Chair Powell try to stay above the fray and continue to talk about how the Fed is focused on its mission.
So he's got a job in this news conference tomorrow. We'll, of course, bring this to our viewers and listeners here on Bloomberg TV and radio. As part of our special coverage will be the news conference. The questions are going to be somewhat different here and geared toward Trump compared to anything that we've seen in recent memory. Does he have to kind of calibrate his response that way as well?
He's going to have to calibrate his response.
He's got an audience of one.
Yeah, what we heard him say at the last press conference was that, you know, in many ways it was too soon to know how the policy outlook for the Fed will be impacted by some of these Trump policies because the policies in many ways are still undefined. So that's going to be a question. But I think you're also going to see him I think you're going to have people paying close attention to what he's saying about inflation because at the last press conference, he was very cautious about the inflation outlook. But since then, we've gotten some encouraging reports. I think people are going to be listening very closely to how he sees inflation evolving in the months to come and what that's going to mean for the possibility of rate cuts.
When the issue of tariffs comes up, he doesn't really have much to comment on. We haven't seen anything implemented.
That's right.
Where does Jay Powell fall on this, and how concerned is he about that being a reality?
I think you're going to see him continue to say what he's been saying, that they can't prejudge, right? They're going to wait for more details on the policy before they start to really talk about what that means for the policy outlook. That being said, there are some Fed officials who have said, look, tariffs, immigration, all of those things matter for the policy outlook. And so I am already incorporating some of the potential impacts of these policies into my forecast. But I think you're going to see Powell continue to try to walk a very careful line.
This will be a very interesting conversation to follow tomorrow. With the help of Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe. Thank you so much, Amara. Programming note, be sure indeed to tune in to tomorrow's Bloomberg Surveillance, The Fed Decides, special coverage, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
When Biden and Xi Jinping meet to discuss foreign policy issues, time and again, I've heard this from Biden administration officials, time and again, Xi Jinping changes the topic back to these export controls and why he needs them to go away immediately. He's not asking to get rid of them because they aren't working. He's asking to get rid of them because they are working, because they are imposing significant costs.
That was Gregory Allen, director of the Wadhwani AI Center at CSIS yesterday on Balance of Power. A really important conversation you can find online. A lot of people have been listening to it because we learned so much in this clinic with Gregory, discussing export controls, for instance, with China when it comes to high-tech chips and semiconductor manufacturing that brought us to the whole DeepSeek story. Joining us now with more is Mary Lovely, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Mary, it's great to have you back. Indeed, we had this moment yesterday. DeepSeek is just an example where some slightly older technology was used to jump the gun on much more advanced technology. Does that say to us that export controls need to be tightened? Or China's just outsmarting us when it comes to these programs?
I think it sort of says neither, and a little bit of both. I know it sounds strange, but you know, on the one hand, we're seeing that China is able to do more than we thought with less than we are willing to give them. So in that sense, it was a surprise. On the other hand, imitation is not innovation. So we are seeing the export controls have an effect, as Greg Allen said yesterday on Bloomberg. And I'm sure there's a lot of thought being given in Washington tonight about whether export controls need to be tightened in some ways, expanded in others. But still, we are seeing the effect of export controls in that the Chinese were forced to do a lot with less.
Is this something the Trump administration should be leaning into, particularly when it comes to manufacturing equipment for chips, the things that we're talking about that we already can't buy or China cannot buy from NVIDIA? Or should he be leaning more into the tariff approach, which he talks so much about?
Well, export controls will clearly be on the menu. And I think a key issue will be trying to prevent routes for circumvention of the existing controls. The Biden administration made some changes to the controls very recently. We have to see how those are working. But there will be, in some sense, doubling down on the controls that we do have and seeing if we need to expand them further. On the tariff front, I really think that that's not so much about technology at the forefront. The question is going to be whether we're going to see more decoupling of sort of ordinary or everyday technology, chips that are not at the frontier. Will we be trying to tax Chinese-made chips that go into devices that are assembled in other countries, for example? So there were many people today talking about whether tariffs on Taiwanese chips would affect the iPhone. But, those chips don't come directly to the United States. They go to other locations for production, as they do in so many other products. So tamping down on those or taxing those chips that are built into other products is just a whole nother order of magnitude of difficulty in terms of taxing and then preventing rerouting. So there really has to be more explanation as to what the national security justifications for these are, I think, especially in light of what happened with DeepSeek, because Americans want to know, what are we gaining for these actions?
Well, that's fascinating. As we kind of broaden our scope then on the United States relationship with China to other elements here, and you consider the global struggle, if you will, in the eyes of the Trump administration that's happening right here in this hemisphere, with eyes on Panama, for instance. I spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power with Rob Waters, a managing partner, founder of the Madison Group. Here's what he had to say about China's global actions that seem to be prompting this response.
China in itself has violated the Monroe Doctrine, and we are just seeing it step by step, both in the Panama Canal. We're seeing it in Latin and South America. We're seeing it, with AI. We are seeing where they are head-to-head competing with us. And how do we control that other than, export control and tariffs?
Back to export controls and tariffs, Mary, where we started our conversation. Panama is going to be the first stop, or one of the first stops, that Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, makes on his first trip representing this administration. What's the message?
Well, I think it's good that Marco Rubio is going. He has a lot of foreign policy experience and a broad view on China's role in the global economy. I'm sure his message will be, we want you on our side, and there are dangers to, getting too far integrated with China. We can't say integrating with China because China is already in Latin America. There is a danger of thinking that we're back 100 years ago or so and we can control other countries. That simply isn't true. Even tariffs and threats of the type that we saw against Colombia most recently are unlikely to really do the trick and may in fact backfire on the United States in terms of driving countries deeper into integrating with China.
Fascinating. Well, the Monroe Doctrine that Rob Waters talks about brings us back more than 100 years. That's 1823. What does China think of the Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah, I know. I think there's a big danger in that. And it's U.S. is a large, powerful country, full stop. But there are limits. Other countries are sovereign nations, and there has to be a positive game to this as opposed to just threats. What is the U.S. going to do to ensure that these countries are willing to engage with us, are willing to face up and assist us with the challenges that we're seeing in dealing with a more aggressive China? Where are the positive trade, investment, infrastructure moves that the U.S. is going to make? We saw the Biden administration talk about such moves. Unfortunately, the reality was rather weak tea. It's something that needs to be on the menu.
Well, you talk about Colombia and the brief trade war we had during lunch on Sunday. Now that this has happened, have we shown our cards in this case? Can the Trump White House play that hand again? Or will it next be about implementing tariffs and removing them when certain conditions are met?
Well, you know, Colombia is a small nation. It is dependent on trade. We're not its largest export destination anymore. But, you know, there's a limit to how far these things can go. There is this, you know, demonstration effect. Let's try this, and then we'll show the world that we mean business. For small countries, where surely it will gain some traction. For larger countries, surely not. And over the longer cycle, it's basically telling other countries, international businesses, that the U.S. will act erratically, it will act in its own interests, and that it's better to work around the U.S. rather than with the U.S. So I think there's serious long-term questions about exactly how the U.S. is not just putting itself first, but making itself a leader versus isolating itself by pushing other countries away.
A lot to think about there. Mary Lovely, it's great to have you back. She's senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Mary, thank you. Coming up, we'll have a look at the Republican retreat, the House retreat happening in Miami, Florida, Donald Trump's Club Doral, with our political panel. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We'll be in these long sessions with the House Republicans working through the agenda. You all heard me talk about the proverbial playbook that we developed over the last year leading up to this moment that we knew would happen. And now we're working out the final sequence of the plays. And so some big decisions will be made here in the next few days, and we'll align with the Senate and our colleagues there, and we will move forward on that agenda. The reconciliation process, the appropriations that we have to wrap up, and the other issues that are upon us.
Speaker Johnson talking about the Republican retreat happening right now in Doral, Florida, Donald Trump's golf club in Miami, as they plot out how to enact President Trump's agenda. Joining us now, this evening's political panel, Maura Gillespie is back with us, the founder principal, Blue Stack Strategies, our Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Matt Bennett, Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Third Way. Great to see both of you. Great to have you back in the conversation. Matt, you worked for a former Republican speaker. This is one with a much smaller majority than John Boehner certainly ever realized. Struggling to find a direction here on a congressional agenda, on a reconciliation plan. They've been down there for days. They were doing the water slide. They had dinner on the lawn, we're told. They've had lots of hours of golf. Has it made a difference?
This is one of the problems, too. I think when you're a majority that is, trying to get a lot of things done, but you have a president who is really putting a heavy hand on the operations of Congress. And so there isn't an identity for Mike Johnson right now. I think he's echoing a lot of things that Trump has told him to be pushing, but not necessarily conferencing with the people he needs to make sure they're all on board. Because when you have such a slim majority, you have to make sure that your team is with you. And we saw some people that aren't there. Chip Roy's not there. There's a handful of others who are criticizing the fact that these policies aren't going to address the deficit. And for a lot of members on the far right flank, that's their number one priority. And it doesn't seem as though it's matching up right now.
And they want more cuts, of course.
More cuts. Absolutely.
So they won't return from Miami with a plan, is I think what you're saying. Is that right?
It
Will we have one bill
or
two? Do we know?
Well, it'll regurgitate whatever Trump decides. Whatever he says right now is what they're going to do.
Okay.
And I don't know that goes the same for the Senate.
I don't care is kind of what he's saying, isn't it?
As long as he gets what he wants. And he, unfortunately, what he wants changes from 1 minute to the next. And I don't know that the Senate's going to be as in line with what Speaker Johnson is showing that he will be when it comes to Trump. But we'll see. I mean, really, unfortunately, when it comes to Donald Trump, it remains unknown until the votes are happening.
So, Matt, what's Democrats' role here? What's Hakeem Jeffries to do? Because I'm pretty sure a couple of Democratic votes will be needed if they do plow this all into one massive bill. And you're going to have things like wildfire relief in there to offset some concerns about, say, extending the Trump tax cuts. Is this going to work?
I don't know. I mean, eventually it's going to work. I don't think we're going to default on the debt, that we've threatened to do it a bunch of times. It would be insane. I don't think anyone involved in this process is that crazy.
So debt limit has to be in this. This is going to be a massive piece of legislation.
It sounds like it, but let's remember why we are here. When they passed the tax cuts the first time, they did it on budget reconciliation, which requires that the deficit go down over 10 years. To do that, they made them sunset, with the full expectation that they would be brought back. So it was a complete nonsense lie that the deficit was going to come down. And here we are again dealing with it. But now it's much worse because we have inflation. It's much harder to deal with deficits. And the situation for the speaker is much tighter politically. Both economically and politically, things are much, much worse than they were last time.
Maura, you mentioned Chip Roy. Is there a Democrat for every Chip Roy that Mike Johnson can work with here?
I don't think it'll be that easy. It'd be nice to think that, but it won't be. There are some Democrats, though, who have expressed, getting rid of the debt ceiling altogether. So, I mean, Trump could find allies there and convince them to work with Mike Johnson on a plan that gets Trump what he wants, which is getting rid of the debt ceiling, but also getting a plan that does reduce the deficit, but gives tax breaks to people that, Trump has shown in the past that he prefers to do so with, and thinking that that's going to create the economy that's going to lower gas prices, lower grocery costs, and open up housing. But will that come to fruition? I'm not sure.
Well, it's interesting you say that because we're looking at the potential for votes as late as April, as early as February. That's the timeline that Mike Johnson rolled out there. That's not possible, is it?
Doesn't feel possible.
I mean, they have all year to do this.
Well, they got to do the debt ceiling sooner or else we hit the ledge.
Sure, in terms of Trump tax cuts, but yes, of course.
Trump tax cuts, I think, will take longer, probably. And they're probably going to have to split this up. I think this one big, beautiful bill thing is a Trump fantasy that is not going to happen. But in terms of who would benefit from the tax cuts, you have only to look at the tableau of people pictured at the inauguration. Those are the people that are going to benefit. There are a bunch of billionaires, and they're going to do extremely well from these tax cuts. But to get the cuts necessary to make the far right happy enough and to get to within the budget parameters of reconciliation, they're going to have to cut things that are incredibly hard, and that means really taking it out on poor people, Medicaid, SNAP, that kind of thing.
So was this a good experience or not for the Speaker's office to have everybody in one room? They're all in the Donald J. Trump dining hall today for 9 to 5. It was like an 8-hour shift. Is that helpful for the Speaker of the House to get everyone together at the same time?
Internally, it is helpful to get morale going and for people to bond. And a lot of the times that's what these retreats are for, is for members to get to know each other a little better on a personal level. Introducing their families to each other and talking about their kids, going for a round of golf. I mean, we see that being, maybe on the outside, it seems frivolous, but actually on the inside, that's how people get relationships that will help them, whether they're working on a committee together or, hey, we really need you to get on board with this vote. What could we do to help you? They'll be able to have those conversations and see what members' priorities are. But it's a good bonding experience. So, yes, it is beneficial. Will it produce a bill that will make everybody happy and be that one big, beautiful bill? No, but it will help them work together better in the future.
Last retreat like this cost $1.3 million. It was at the Greenbrier. This is at Donald Trump's country club.
Yes, the emoluments clause, once again, is taking a beating in the Trump administration. The hamburgers they served literally had Trump's name branded onto the bun. I mean, they're not hiding the ball here.
They are well done, though, I understand.
Indeed.
Coming up, Maura Gillespie, Matt Bennett, stay with us. Our great panel will have much more as we take a look at the first press briefing of the second Trump administration. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is not a blanket pause on federal assistance and grant programs from the Trump administration. Assistance that is going directly to individuals will not be impacted by this pause. And I want to make that very clear to any Americans who are watching at home who may be a little bit confused about some of the media reporting. This administration, if you are receiving individual assistance from the federal government, you will still continue to receive that. However, it is the responsibility of this president and this administration to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt's debut in the briefing room, trying in many cases to clean up confusion there and a lot of questions over a memo that paused federal grants loans and financial assistance. A federal judge now temporarily pausing that order, a headline that broke just before we came to air this evening. As we reassemble our political panel, Maura Gillespie and Matt Bennett are with us. Matt, I don't know your thoughts on this. Chuck Schumer says it blatantly disobeys the law. There are questions about exactly what programs from Head Start to Medicaid this may impact. How long can this judge's ruling hold?
Well, it's only until February 3rd, and we don't know what happens after that, and that is causing incredible amounts of chaos. Every school child knows that Congress has the power of the purse, and Congress has made very clear under the Impoundment Act that you can't do this. This is illegal, and this is having real-world implications. Let me give you one of a million examples. The 988 suicide prevention hotline is still operating, but federal officials are wondering whether they can keep it operating. It gets 20,000 calls from civilians a day, 2,000 from veterans per day. If that goes down, it is going to be a catastrophe, and that is just one of tens of thousands of examples.
It's really a confusing situation because the memo doesn't clarify exactly what programs will be impacted. We do know that there'll be some sort of a washing, though, if this is allowed to go forward. And again, a judge has halted this. They must be aligned with presidential priorities, these spending programs here, when it comes to immigration, foreign aid, DEI. How many of them would survive that criteria, do you think?
It's hard to say because it's based on what Trump's policies are, and they're matching those up against that to say if they violate his policies.
EOs that are only a week old.
Correct. And so it's really, again, I think the problem with today's announcement was that it just created chaos. The President Trump had come out with this, DOGE entity, right? That was just to look at government efficiency. So is that not happening still? I mean, why wouldn't you wait and let that kind of process play out rather than make this decision and upend our economy in a lot of ways? You just threw a lot of confusion. People are very afraid and confused and scared about what that means for them. And so I don't understand the thinking here of using the political capital, because I think a lot of Americans would agree, yes, we need to have an audit on our spending. Our government spending is out of control. Great. That's a winning message for Republicans to go on. But when you do this, like the actions that were taking place today, that really shortens your argument. It really belittles it because it doesn't stand as strong as what people would agree with.
Yeah.
But doing it in this way and so haphazardly, it's a disservice.
We're going to get some pretty interesting, if I could use that term, confirmation hearings in the next couple of days when you consider Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., and Kash Patel. On Sunday on Meet the Press on NBC, Senator Lindsey Graham had this to say about Donald Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence, the former Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard.
I tend to vote for almost everybody at both parties, but I want to see how the hearing goes. Why did you go to Syria? What did you do regarding Assad? Why do you think Edward Snowden should be held as a hero? I certainly don't. We'll see how the hearing goes. But in her favor, Richard Burr is going to introduce her, and he's one of my dearest friends. So we'll see.
We're hearing some 15 Republican senators are prepared to vote no. Can she even clear committee? There's a majority of one on that Intelligence Committee.
Not if that continues. She's definitely not going to get out of committee. But think about how Trump has been handling this. They sat her at the inauguration next to the CEO of TikTok, a company that the U.S. Congress has decided is basically a Chinese spy agency. Yeah. They put her next to it. So they're really sticking it in the face of the senators when they do this. But I want to make clear she's not the only one. RFK Jr. Is a profound threat to public health. There are all kinds of diseases circulating right now, including avian flu, that could turn into a pandemic. Putting that guy in charge of our public health would be an incredibly dangerous move. And it's on a knife's edge, the Senate.
Well, we heard from Caroline Kennedy today, and we know that many members of the Kennedy family are not in support of his politics. Caroline Kennedy putting up a letter that will be submitted to the committee that refers to RFK Jr. as a predator. Does he need to address things like the polio vaccine in his opening remarks to be approved?
I think he's going to have to address this from Caroline Kennedy. Yeah. I think that's going to come up. I mean, obviously it's being submitted, and that's a huge question mark over his head. You already have Senator Bill Cassidy, who has expressed discomfort with his choice. So has Senator Mitch McConnell. And so when you're faced with these very big questions over him, that's going to have to be addressed almost, I think, if not in his opening statements, very well short after.
We're out of time, but is there a world in which Mitch McConnell votes yes on RFK Jr.? No way?
I highly doubt it.
There you have it. Maura Gillespie and Matt Bennett, great panel and a great conversation. Thank you so much for being with us. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter for a lot more on all the stories we talked about and to get ready for the confirmation hearings the next 2 days. You can find it on the terminal and online. Thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. I'll be back here tomorrow with Kaylee Lyons, right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.